My guest today, I'm pleased to welcome back Christof Plothe. He's a naturopath, he's an osteopath, as well as an important couple of roles with the World Council of Health, both with the steering committee and the science lead. Christof, welcome back to the EMF Remedy podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Keith. It's always a pleasure.
So I really enjoyed our conversation last year, and I was hoping we could talk more about my favorite topic. I know it's one of your favorite topics as well, which is synthetic field exposures that have become so common, and hardly anybody lives in an area where they're not affected by these synthetic field exposures. And whether we might talk about medical issues, and particularly your clinical experience in working with people that have been affected. And so one question I didn't ask you last time, I'm interested in knowing, how did you first become aware that synthetic fields might be a potential health issue?
Oh, because of two reasons. One of them being that I've been working as an osteopath for 30 years. So I've been able to palpate people's body, and the body has an inherent rhythm of about 6 to 8 times per minute, which you use in order to follow the fascia in order to find lesions in the body. And the more synthetic fields were introduced to people, and you and I still know a planet that was more or less, apart from the background noises of radio, television, radar, and other things, still in comparison today quite clean of all these exposures. And I taught at university in many parts of the world, postgraduate courses for osteopaths, and all of a sudden I realized that I can't teach them anything anymore, because when the tissues are not moving, how am I supposed to teach what the tissues are demonstrating to you? Because they just didn't. So I eventually had to give up teaching because I couldn't do that anymore, because I didn't know what I was doing there. And that was the part of my working field. And then I started to get cramps whenever I was around people using the mobile phones. I got dizzy, I get headaches, the whole array of symptoms that you've experienced yourself in the past. And I didn't quite know what to make out of this, because I wasn't taught anything about it. Nobody was talking. And if somebody was talking about it, it was a conspiracy, tinfoil hat, where that was already right from the beginning, the conspiracy behind it. But when I started realizing that, I really dug into it, and I just went on the plains and just visited people that had something to say in that field. That's how I got my knowledge from. And then I realized, well, first of all, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, we're an electric body. Of course, if you get exposed to fields that are far above what controls our brain, our heart, our muscles, even the mitochondria, so even the little cells all have their electric potential. If that exceeds that, of course, it's common sense that it must have an influence on our body.
So how long ago, do you recall approximately what year it was that, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, you were unable to feel the waves that naturally come from our organs as propagated through the fascia at a certain point in time? Did I put that correctly?
Yeah. Well, I'm very bad when it comes to years, but it was around 20 years ago. Yeah, when I started, that was when basically everybody was starting wearing their mobile phones. We didn't have the smartphones yet. Yeah, that are a completely different league since they were entered. Yeah, since they entered. But yeah, I at that time I still had a little mobile phone, a little Nokia, in which I could call people, and I did, yeah, but that was about all you could do with it. But I started realizing, yeah, when using it, I did feel different. Well, I never had a smartphone. I've never years, yeah, but I used it then in the transition stage for text messages, because I still wanted to be reachable, but I gave that all up now.
I remember you mentioned in our last conversation as well about the fasciculations, or you can put your tongue out and you can actually see that you're not able to keep it steady if you're in a synthetic field environment for any time. And so I'm wondering here how humans are doing now with their organs not operating as they did before, or at least the waves not being propagated through the fascia as before. I guess there's no way to get a real handle on that, but do you ever Do you ever consider what the magnitude is of propagating the cell phone infrastructure for everybody to contend with, and then the actual cell phones themselves together with Wi-Fi?
Every day, Keith. Because, like I told you last time, there are these signs, and people sometimes talk of electrohypersensitivity syndrome. Yeah, I don't think that exists because we are all basically affected. So some people perceive it more than others, that they have the influence. And before I go into that, I'll tell you a little story. I was a few weeks ago at my son's university in Norway. You know, the Scandinavian countries, they're completely crazy with 5G and all the digital advantages and inverted commas that we have in our days. So I was confronted with these fields. I had my meter with me, and it never climbed below 20,000 microwatts per square meter. And after 10 microwatts per square meter, you already have the first cellular DNA damage. Yeah, so that's quite high. And if I would go into a bus or I would go into a public place, it wouldn't go down from over 1.2 million microwatts per square meter. So completely insane measurements. And the interesting thing was that in the first night I slept at the flat of my son, I couldn't sleep. I had cramps all night. It was really, I was there for 4 days. I said, well, I don't know how to survive this, but something strange happened, Keith. That's the thing why so many people discuss the issue whether that actually exists or not, a sensitivity towards all those radiations. I became completely insensitive to it. Yeah, for the first time for I don't know how many years, I didn't feel a thing. Yeah, I could sleep in the rooms. I could go into public places. I didn't have the cramps, nothing. It took me 2 weeks to get sensitive again because I thought, oh my God, yeah, I've overcome my sensitivity towards these things, which many people say they feel sorry for me, yeah, that I can't stay too long in public places and I can't go out for hours and hours like in the past with friends in a restaurant, whatever. But actually, Keith, I think it's a healthy thing to feel it. So I don't mind that. I know when I start to get my cramps, it's time for me to go. That's what I'm doing then. All of a sudden I could understand why all the people in big cities, because that's basically anytime you go in big city, that's EMF overload that you're encountering there. Why we can't discuss things like it because they don't really feel it. Yeah. And you're doing wonderful projects by taking people out in nature for them to test the difference. And I told you last time we did that in Brazil. We had a clinic in the middle of the jungle in order to take neurological patients with us. That was with environmental doctors from all over the world to see the difference. And the difference for all of us was so striking. You know the feeling when it's almost like putting a helmet of your head. Yeah. And we felt completely different. The patients got so much better without doing anything. Yeah, we basically exposed them to nature. As you just mentioned, for those who hadn't seen the first part of it, one thing that we ask people to do, to show them that electromagnetic frequencies have an influence on them, we ask them to stick out their tongue. And if they have been exposed for quite a while on that day, they can't keep their tongue still. So it's little fasciculations on the tongue that tremble all the time, especially in the young. It's very, very apparent. Yeah, with of course their excessive use of mobile phones and tablets in their classrooms, they get a first impression that there is something going on in the head, because it's basically a sign that cranial nerves are being irritated. So the central nervous system is being stimulated, hyperstimulated, and then they watch themselves in the mirror and they can see, well, something is not as it should be. And some people really have difficulty to even control their tongue. Yeah? So if that's really, really a strong exposure. And the other thing that I was talking about is we get this increase in muscle tension. Yeah, on the one hand, it destroys connective tissue, that we know that from connective tissue cell cultures. But on the other hand, the muscle tone is increasing. So I have these young athletes, and I'm treating people from national teams in several sports area, professional sports people, and they're coming, these young, really, really healthy, fit athletes, and they can hardly move when I'm have them lying on this couch, they hardly move their hip more than 20 to 30 degrees. That's all they can do. And so the other trick we use, to show people, and that's usually very impressive for the kids, we use the tuning fork. Yeah, that's a tuning fork. We tested many. I can only advise you to get at one as deep as possible in order to have an effect. And we have found a frequency that works particularly well that we use in our shop, millivital.de, but it doesn't matter. That's just for us the best way to do it. But if you get a tuning fork that is as deep as possible, you use it and put it on your bony structures, on your head, on your chest, on your knees, and on your ankles, resonate there. And we know from studies in Berlin that people had been put in a Faraday cage and they had been exposed to Wi-Fi. And then Professor van Klitzing monitored their heart rate, monitored the EEG, the EMG, and the circulation. And he could see that without people knowing that the Wi-Fi had been activated, parameters changed in all those criteria. So he observed as well that once it's being triggered, and your tissues go in resonance. It's like a gong, you hit a gong and it keeps on vibrating for a long time. There's one even in our area that vibrates for over a day. In fact, he was able to show by just putting an oscilloscope on the body that this happens for up to 2 days. Yeah, you were in a Wi-Fi field, you get your 2.4 gigahertz at 10 hertz a frequency in your system, and it keeps on resonating. And this is one thing that by using the tuning fork gets the body out of that resonance, and all of a sudden the muscle tone decreases, and all of a sudden these young people can move their hips 90 degrees in each direction. That's always very impressive, and they can see that something is there. If you make it palpable for people by putting them in nature, it takes a while and not everybody can do it, but with a tuning fork, you can just do it within minutes and people see a difference. And then they say, well, maybe he's not that crazy after all.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the assuming people are crazy, hopefully a little bit later on. But it's so interesting to me what you said about EHS. I'm not sure if there is something called EHS and I would like to talk a little bit more about that, and then also the tuning forks. So let me start with the tuning forks first. After our last conversation, I bought several. I tried them on myself, and I really found a benefit. And in fact, I showed my wife, and now both my wife and my son, when we come back from town, where's the tuning fork? They want to, they want to use it. So also, I know many people, because of the work that I do, going into their homes and cleaning up their EMF environment, just a tiny fraction of people really seek out what I would call a pristine environment, levels of synthetic field exposures that can't be measured by, the common equipment that we have. And those people live very different lives. And so I have friends around the world like this. And so I recommended the tuning fork. I sent several of them out, and only one person said they preferred something else. He was doing a humming that he had been practicing for years and projecting that into different organs and whatnot. But everybody else loved the tuning fork. And so, for whatever anecdotal, evidence that is may be of interest. But anyway, the tuning forks really have been a great help to people, I think. And we were as well using that 136.1 frequency. And then you were mentioning on this topic about EHS and whether it really exists. I've had some very interesting conversations recently with Dr. Johansson about a number of different things, and as well as my sensitive friends around the world. And a phenomenon I'm just on the verge of writing about on my Substack, and I haven't yet done it, is this acquired non-sensitivity in spouses that are married to people who are sensitive and are living a pristine lifestyle. So each of those is very important, and particularly the pristine lifestyle. So you have a spouse who has never admitted any kind of electrical sensitivity or felt that they were sensitive at all in life. And yet, after a time of living with somebody who is in a pristine environment, they can suddenly feel this, I think it's just an avoidance behavior that maybe we all had once upon a time. So I just mentioned that because it's so interesting. You were saying that your system was overrun and you could no longer feel it. I do think
Yeah.
it is a blessing for people who have it, because if for no other reason, it allows them to avoid behaviors. So any comment on what I just said about people that I've known who really get to pristine environments, their spouses realize maybe that they've already always had electrical sensitivity. Maybe their immune system had been compromised and then it recovered to again warn them of the danger. And I would love your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, maybe I go back a step when you kindly shared the experiences with the tuning folk in the people that you know. Well, one of the most heavily affected people by constantly being bombarded on their body with Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and other frequency for that matter are people that wear wearables. So especially when it comes to insulin pumps, or I had in the last few years a lot of time to observe this, because these people, with it independent of their age, they're with a constant bombardment 24/7 on their bodies with it. They are not only stiff, they can hardly move. Even in young children, they can hardly move their shoulders. Yeah, it's only 30, 40 degrees, and the hips maybe 10 to 20, and they get pains all over their body. Yeah, because they're constantly inflamed. So inflammation is not a good idea, and it might be even ironic if you have diabetes type 2, and we have loads of studies showing that even having animals, lab animals in a Wi-Fi or in an environment that mimics the radiation of a mobile phone, after 24 hours, their pancreas is gone. And so you can use them for diabetic research. So it's a little bit, ironic that you have a problem with your pancreas, and then we know also that it gets problems in the glucose uptake, and it has direct influence on the organ that creates the diabetes. So hard for them to get out, because diabetes type 2 is actually a curable disease. Diabetes type 1 is another thing. But I won't judge people that with diabetes type 2 are on a monitor if they don't find the discipline in order to change a lifestyle and diet. What we experienced, I just had a patient, he's 84 and he has diabetes. And since having this pump, he's getting this stiffness, he's getting the pains. He wakes up with pains already, and he has been diagnosed with all kinds of rheumatic diseases and whatever. And he just used the tuning fork 5 times to 10 times a day, and all his symptoms disappeared. He doesn't have any pains. He doesn't have any restriction in the joints anymore. So even if you do that on a repetitive level, the body seems to get reminded and has the capacity, at least for a while, until it gets into resonance with the other frequencies again. That's my interpretation of what I see, that even for a few moments in which it can function normally, it's enough to get control back over their bodies. That's just to that one effect. And the other, what you were saying, yes, I do believe that there are things that make you more sensitive. That is, if you just cut down on the exposure, you will immediately learn more about how your body is reacting to it. And the other one is all the frequencies in nature. I mean, that's how we met with Zaid's wonderful substacks on chronobiology, and knowing that everything around us is frequencies, and we're constantly reminded by the infrared spectrum in the evening of the sun, or the blue spectrum in the mornings, that give us energy, that we're influenced by all these frequencies that come from the sun. And I wrote this substack a while ago, that basically our mitochondria are very, very simple to the plant kingdom, the chlorophyll. So it's not just that the sun, we learned that all at school, sun comes in, photosynthesis kicks in, that then the plant creates energy. The same mechanism is happening in our cells. So The sun that's out there gives us the resonance. And in fact, any living creature has its own resonance. We're able to even use that in certain frequency therapies. Every organ has a specific frequency that you can use in several other types of frequency. Even homeopathy is a frequency medicine, and that's why it works, and it doesn't have to be biochemical. So we can see that we're constantly by the earth magnetic field, when earthing, all the things that you often talked about, we are dependent on the anti-inflammatory contact by touching earth, because we have the negative ions, and they decrease inflammation in our system. Just to get a little impression of the frequencies that we're surrounded with, and everybody knows when you go to the sea, when you go up and high in the mountains, you feel better. We can prove that with all the influences that are there. Modern term is biophilia. The biophilia effect. If you go into nature, it's one of my favorite hobbies, actually, to create all the studies why we do feel better in nature. And that's one thing that I found in patients as well, that no matter how high their exposure, the more they're out in nature, they seem to be able to counteract all the influences of that. And that makes a lot of sense if you think that, if you're creating a constant inflammation by being exposed to your mobile phone, then to breathe in, standing at the sea, negative ions that actually decrease inflammation. Or you touch with your feet the sand on the beach, and you can show. I was working with the Doctors to Care during the Tour de France, the discovery team, when Lance Armstrong was still not known to have consumed other methods in order to get his trophies. But the entire team was earthed during the night and could decrease substantially their inflammation, which made them so much better. So decreasing is one thing that makes people more sensitive, and increasing natural frequencies and natural fields around us is the other thing, I think, that sensitizes people and makes them better.
Very interesting. And then with regard to the question about recovering, losing and then recovering the ability to have avoidance behavior, do you think that's just another manifestation of the immune system damage that can be caused by synthetic fields? Or what are your thoughts about that phenomenon?
In which way? What do you mean?
As I was saying, with very sensitive people who have chosen to live a pristine lifestyle, maybe either in a shielded home or in a pristine environment, their spouses become electrically sensitive, which is to say that after a period of time, and this happened with my wife as well, she would say, never, 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 she would say, was she sensitive? And then she realized, after living in a pristine environment for an amount of time, she was able to feel acutely the damage of, being in a room full of women who all have their smartphones on. And so it's very interesting to me that seems like it might be a manifestation of something we lose in our immune system that might be regained with enough time in a pristine environment. So would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, there's something called habituation in biology, when we adapt as adaptation to environmental stressors, to emotional stress. Well, very simple example, your olfactory sense, so your nose, you get exposed to a smell that you like or you don't like, but after a few minutes, you don't smell it anymore. So that's in a way the same mechanism. We get used to something, not to overstimulate our body. Yeah, that's a simple neurological mechanism. Yeah, because otherwise we go crazy. If we would constantly try to deal with all the information coming in from all our senses, and this wouldn't decline, we would go crazy after an hour. Yeah, and that's what a German professor, I don't know if you know her, Teuchert Noth, she's done amazing work on hyperstimulation through our senses, and was able to show, she's a true genius in my eyes, she was able to show that this decreases dopamine production in the frontal lobes, and thus we can't think, because the frontal lobe is our consciousness. This is basically where we distinguish ourselves from animals. And I don't know, you've probably seen the latest study study from Norway and Sweden with children being compared when it comes to their cognitive skills, memory, and others from 2006 to today. And I was really shocked when hearing this, that basically it wasn't an 85% decline, but 85 times decline in their cognitive skills. Yeah, in just that short amount of time from 2006 to nowadays. So it just shows you that overstimulation, that's another mechanism, also makes you numb. Yeah, it literally deactivates many parts of our brain that we need in order to process all the information. And every teacher can tell you about it nowadays. Yeah, when it comes to attention span, concentration, memory function, etc., that is decreasing. So I'd strongly believe, that, and I've made that experience all the time. Because we live out in the woods like you, we don't have any exposure, luckily, yet with all of these. When even friends of my children that are constantly in a big city with everything, they come to our place, usually they get so tired that sometimes they just fall asleep. So their body just goes down. And after they've spent a night with us and we turn off all electricity during the night, we have a main switch and we shut off absolutely everything apart from the fridge and the heating system. They feel it. They said, I've never slept like that before. So when you show people another environment that basically is determined by natural fields and not unnatural fields, I do believe everybody will feel that. But the other thing that I experienced, Keith, and that is a big worry to me as well, when we use the tuning fork, we have more and more people that can't feel it in many parts of their body, and especially not in the head. When you use the tuning fork, the main part where you can hear it and feel it is your head, isn't it? You put it on and you feel the vibration, you can hear it. I have more and more patients that can't hear or can't feel a thing on their head.
Oh my, that's amazing.
It's really amazing.
Sound conduction is quite strong through the bones.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. And it's standard medical test in order to determine your auditory perception. Yeah. It's bone conduction that you test. Yeah. They don't hear, they don't feel anything. And that's a big worry. Yeah. And I see that more and more. We are able to show, when we talk about electrohypersensitivity, there are blood markers that you can observe. Yeah, you can find the interleukin 6 that's raised. You can see the S100 going down. That's the interface to the brain. That's the blood-brain barrier function. Yeah, declining. There are only two ways to interpret that. It's either a melanoma or a problem with the blood-brain function, barrier function. So that's a big worry, because you have all these toxins that shouldn't go into the brain that basically end up there. And when we look at the MRI scans nowadays, there's hardly any MRI, and I still know the difference from 30 years ago. There's hardly any MRI that doesn't have diverse deposits all over the place that usually were labeled MS in the past, but that's almost the norm now. So we can see those changes. I haven't seen a study yet looking at that, but I can see that on a daily basis. The neurological function with people basically having problems in all their senses. The eyes are getting worse. The ears are getting worse. And the sensory perception in their body is getting worse. Of course, it's always an accumulation of many things. There are many synergistic toxins out there that can create that. And I could list a whole bunch of them. Yeah. But the problem is that we don't have a control group. We don't have people that have never used a mobile phone in their lives. That has been completely erased. So how do we want to say that it's basically this? That's why we'll always remain these weird people that are talking about something that is so blatantly obvious. I mean, when I was writing essays with Arthur Firstenberg, who's not with us anymore, who was extreme in his sensitivity and thus had to protect himself in an extreme way, Keith, I don't know how you feel about it, but if I would really retrieve in the woods for a month and month and month without any connection to that, I think I would be close to a convulsion when going into the next city. And we had that in the past when I started playing with it. I went around with my meters. I was in a restaurant. I went into the kitchens. I went everywhere. I asked people. I was highly, highly embarrassing to my family and to all my friends that went out with me somewhere.
Right, right.
But that's how I collected my information. And when we did that, and I found such a striking difference, I got people on chronic exhaustion. Yeah, you have all these people being called now burnout patients. I believe most burnout patients are basically electro hypersensitive people, if you want to put it that way, or they're burned out by too much exposure of low frequencies and high frequencies. And I got these people on an island in the north of Germany that at that time, that was 20 years ago, didn't have any mobile phone towers, and there was lots of space around any house. And there were a few houses in which people didn't have even Wi-Fi or anything near. And I tell you, they were almost wheelchair bound, some of them. They were so exhausted, their mitochondria were so exhausted, we could prove it in their blood works, that they could not function. They went to this place that was still radiation free, and they started walking, and they felt normal after a few hours. And when they started going into the next village, bang, you could have put them in a wheelchair again. So that was, for me, another sign of the phenomena that you're just talking about. Yeah, people, they didn't feel any difference when being exposed to any of those high frequency or low frequency fields. But when they got out, they could see by being re-exposed to them, whoa, as you were talking with your wife about your wife, then you can feel the difference.
So can we imagine that there are any people in the world today that are not affected by synthetic fields?
I don't think so. I mean, I was a lot in Africa 2 years ago. I was a lot in South America and Costa Rica last year. I can see all these children already with their tablets and mobile phones everywhere. Yeah, you would have to go deep into the jungle, and even there probably they would use them. I was in remote African villages, and everybody was so proud having his mobile phone on all the time in their pockets. Yeah, and I could see all the health problems that they were getting, and the trembling in the elderlies. Yeah, there was hardly any elderly that didn't have a tremor of some sort. Yeah, so talking about neurological damage, well, no, there's no such place, and I think we have to create them. That's my mission. I'm quite adamant. I want a control group. I want to be a part of that control group. I want people to be able to live in an area where we have a right, and we can have a right of informed consent of what we want to be exposed to or not. Because I have a problem that people expose all of us without us having any rights to say no. Yeah, when it comes to smart meters, when it comes to public Wi-Fi, when it comes to radiation from above, yeah, from all those satellites. I want, as a citizen, the right to have an informed consent and make my own decisions about a sovereign life.
And that's one of the things that I think about is that, for example, the infrastructure for mobile phones implies involuntary exposure to all of us. And some people view that as service, because their mobile phone works. But for those of us who know better, there's not a way to opt out within a community. I don't want this involuntary exposure. I don't want this service. And the same thing at every restaurant now has Wi-Fi, and every coffee shop has Wi-Fi, and the public libraries, at least here, have these involuntary exposures as well. And the fact that people, once they've stayed a while, they can't feel it any longer doesn't bode well. And the absence of a control group doesn't bode well, because people will simply look and say, they look to their left, they look to their right, they say everybody is fatigued. Nobody can sleep well. Nobody has this is a normal attention span. What are you even talking about? And so that's the situation right now. And I kind of wonder how we got here, frankly, because there was more than enough information available. For example, you mentioned the blood-brain barrier. There was more than enough information available experimentally that showed the dissolution of the blood-brain barrier in the 1970s, before this whole mobile phone craze came into fruition. And you see these curious other artifacts of this, and yet we pressed forward. And so I can't help but wonder if somehow, Christof, propaganda stood in the place of science, or is standing in the place of science, not only in this area, but in others as well. You have any comments on that?
Well, many. You know, the papers that were released to our governments, there were important papers offered to the US government and the German government at the late 70s, when politicians at that time demanded an investigation whether that technology was safe. And we know that the papers that were handed in for the US Senate and in Germany was Professor Hecht. I was working with him for over 10 years. He was the scientific advisor of the German government, who gave them the accumulation of all the studies that had been done by the former Soviet Union, especially when it comes to the safety of all of these technologies. And it was without any doubt harmful to humans. And at that time, they were studying ridiculous strength of intensities, like 30 or 50 microwatts per square meter. So yeah, that's even the normal mobile phone will have a few 10,000 to give a comparison. That was known. They said, no, that's not safe. We shouldn't do it. And we also have the papers that show us, you can freely find them in the internet. Well, nowadays, maybe it might be more difficult, because don't know how about you, but I find it more and more difficult to research something because I don't find anything anymore.
Right.
So that's the next stage of what I can talk about. So we knew that all of this was not safe, and we could see in the responses of those hearings that it was basically rejected because of several factors. And one was competition, economical reasons. If all the others now go ahead with this, we'll be left behind. We can't risk this. And the other thing was the military. The military was very, very keen on all these technologies, and you can see in which ways you can use them now to survey the entire planet. G is not to give us a better internet connection. It's basically to create a surveillance state. And we don't have to look into China. Europe here is full of surveillance cameras. It's full of possibilities to use G for other reasons than just for mobile phones. That's another reason. So there are not only economical reasons, there are political reasons, there are military reasons to keep this system alive. Basically, if I now go into what you could use all those frequencies for, and we know it's no conspiracy that you can create wonderful weapons with them that have been already used in many places of this planet. So there are lots of people that don't really have a keen interest to abandon any of those technologies. And I always say, well, and I've asked so many, because I'm not a technician, when it comes to all those scientific details. I have good friends that can tell me more about this. But if you look at what it basically is, a mobile phone or a mobile tower, it's basically a wave that's a carrier, and then you put an information on it. That's the same with radio. And I was always puzzled as a student in high school how that actually worked. And I asked all my teachers, well, how does a radio wave actually bring the sound to me? If I scream, you can hear it over there because I scream. But if it's a radio wave, how does that actually function? And only many, many years, decades later, I found Professor Meil, who told me in an interview in the middle of the night that it's because of the vacuum in the wave. That didn't really help me to understand what was going on, but it just shows me only a handful of people do really understand what it means. But the carrier wave could be even a natural wave. Why do we use these high pulsed frequencies? And we had Li-Fi as an experiment. It never took off. Yeah. And Arthur wasn't a big, Arthur Fistenberg, that is, was not a great friend of it. I still found it very interesting to use light as a carrier wave because it's out there. And even if you inform it, you don't have that pulsed frequency that we know is very harmful. So I found it definitely a better alternative. But in fact, we could use any frequency of light. We could mimic the frequency of light in every hour of the day, and we could put information on it, and we can use it for our mobile phones and other devices. Wouldn't that be a good suggestion? That's my personal aim, that we could use technology by mimicking nature. And I think that has always been a good advice, not to show this hybris of humans, because if we look at nature under the influence of these frequencies, here, I don't know about you over there, but here it is detrimental. Yeah, you can birch trees. There's hardly any birch trees that have survived in the last few years. You can see how their branches grow like a corkscrew, and you can be sure that you will find the next mobile phone tower next to it. They all fall over and are dead. There are all kinds of diseases that are supposed to hit them, but they haven't really found the one that's killing all the birch trees. They haven't found the mechanism in which all those branches are growing now like corkscrews, and the pine trees are losing all their needles, and most trees are losing the top of their of the trees. That's usually a very good sign that EMF is responsible for the death of that tree, because it will die soon afterwards. So we can see it's not just the insect, and he talked about Professor Johansson and all his research on honeybees. Yeah, it's not just us humans that it harms. It harms all living creatures around there, and we depend on them. And we can't go on like that by increasing the natural background load each year. I mean, a few years ago, when I started doing background measurements, I had my devices and I went into big cities. And each year I compared them with the ones from the year before, and it was exponential. If you look at the amount of devices and infrastructure that's invested, is you go into a car park and you have your license plate monitored. That's, guess what? That's all other artificial radiation apart from a good surveillance. Almost anything around there, the cameras everywhere, etc. The AI that's now being used. Nobody's talking about the consumption of energy, by the way, of all those devices. When we talk about saving energy, it makes me almost smile to see. I read a paper today that 15% of the energy expense in Germany already goes into AI, and it's supposed to increase exponentially. So 15%. So we won't have the possibility here to create that energy, by the way. On many levels, it's a dead-end road. So we need to change our approach to it. And there are solutions. But unfortunately, the people that are in charge of all of this, they deny any negative consequences on any of those levels. So how to talk to them, I don't know.
And I forget the name of the person, but I think it was in ancient Greece, and this was more than 2,000 years ago. There was this search for the vital force. What is the vital force? What do you think the vital force is?
Well, that's another one of my great hobbies, actually, vitalism. I studied a lot, let's put it that way. Let's start that way. I studied a lot with indigenous people from all over the world, from Africa, North America, Canada, Asia, Nepal. And for them, everything alive has a spirit. So any plant has a spirit, any animal has a spirit, yeah, any human has a spirit, and even the elements have a spirit, yeah. So we're entering a spiritual level when talking about life force. And I gave an interview in 2013 in New York at a Gary Null radio show. And it was about near-death experiences, and it was about multiple personality disorders. And if you look at them, it just shows us that we really have no understanding of what life is all about. And we should be a lot more humble when playing with life, because we're now everywhere starting to genetically modify plants, animals, and have done so in the last few years with humans. That was not a good idea, because we don't even understand what life is all about. And if people leave their body in near-death experiences, and I had 4 of them in my practice, and one of them was a child that had never told anybody about this, but it basically fell down the stairs, and the mother came screaming, and it had broken its neck, and it was basically declared dead. And then the doctors came, the paramedics came, and the way the boy described everything that was happening, the mother told him to shut up because he was making this up, but I made them continue to describe until the mother burst out in tears, because the boy was able to describe every little thing that happened in that room from the ceiling. He was observing everything. So what happens? What does that tell us about life? That's also frequencies. What is our spirit when it's able to leave the body? And that's not. I wrote a Substack this week actually about the latest scientific study on this. That they showed without a reasonable doubt that it's not just hallucinations or other biochemical reactions that cause these states, and people to be able to describe what happens when they're dead. So I think before we start playing with vitalism, with our vital force, with our spirit, or whatever you want to call it, we should be able to understand it. And until we don't, we should really have respect for life in all its forms.
So when I left industry, I pursued a lifelong goal. I wanted to work on an ambulance, and I wanted to help people in that way. So I did that for a dozen years. And our protocol in the county in which I worked, when you had somebody who had died in the field, was to get a paramedic en route so that they could verify with the 12 lead a heart activity, absence of heart activity, because that was considered the gold standard. I mean, there were certain signs, obvious signs of lividity and whatnot that anybody could declare. But when there was a question, essentially what we were looking at was purposeful, productive, electrical activity in the body. And so it seems to me one indication of the difference between dead tissue and living tissue is this purposeful electrical activity, and it's vast. It isn't just in the heart, I don't believe, or in the brain. I think it's down to the cellular level. And that doesn't deal with the spiritual aspect. But if what we're talking about, if what I'm really asking is the wisdom of deploying synthetic fields when the living things themselves rely on purposeful electrical activities, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. You and I are both old enough to remember when microwave ovens were first deployed, and they had warning signs, did they not, that if you had a pacemaker, you shouldn't be near the microwave because it would interfere. What about the other pacemaker that everybody has, anyway, so these are some of my thoughts on the topic.
No, exactly. If you go to a filling station, a petrol station here in Germany, it says don't use your mobile phones. If you go into a hospital, on ICU, then don't use your mobile phones. And I always ask myself the same question. It's nice that we protect all the computers here, but what about that up there and this heart down there that is influenced? And I gave an interview this week about cardiovascular influences of EMF, and whilst the research is not strong at all, it just shows you, because on a daily basis we can see people getting their palpitations, getting their blood pressure problems, and when they're out of these fields, it basically stops. In many of those cases, these heart problems stopped. So I don't have the scientific backup, because who's out there to study it? Yeah, I mean, all those wonderful researchers out there, they've basically been deplatformed. Yeah, their labs at the university were closed. Yeah, they had it more and more difficult to get any study out on the market. And I've written about 13 peer-reviewed papers in the last few years. Many of them, many others that I co-wrote weren't even allowed to go into peer reviewing. Yeah, they weren't even accepted. Many of my other papers that I wrote, they were retracted, and even at another stage, they were even taken out of the internet. Yeah, which had never happened before. So when we talk about science, yeah, that's a very important thing that I want to comment on when you talked about that. Well, we know of all the people that were kind of whistleblowers to the scientific field. That was the former editor-in-chief of The Lancet, who said that 60% of the studies in his paper are fraud. Yeah? And there were people from Stanford, there were people from Denmark, Peter Gatsche and Professor Yananidis, on the other hand, that even talk about 90% of being fraud. Yeah, so we can't rely on this religion science anymore, because it basically has been bought by the industry. Medical regulatory boards are 90% financed by the industry, and they determine also the safety of all the EMF gadgets out there. Basically, when everything has been bought, the science, the people that should actually monitor our health safety, the people that deal with it on a daily basis, the medical profession that's constantly being told that's all rubbish. Yeah, you can still see all those papers appearing on a regular basis in all those medical journals. No wonder, yeah, we are not hearing anything about it. And people need to understand this. This is, as you said about when posing the question about an answer to that, why we don't hear more about it. It has become a very thin spider web, yeah, by the industry on all levels that makes it almost impossible to penetrate.
Well, I wonder if you can share any general concepts having to do with healing, at least from an electromagnetic perspective.
Let's put it that way. I think almost any disease will have an EMF part nowadays in it. Whether that's the polyarthritis in their bodies and the pains are getting worse, whether that's the palpitation of the heart and the mobile phone will make it worse, whether that's the dementia and you put people next to a Wi-Fi router and it gets worse. So there's hardly anything that isn't very sensitive to inflammation. And we know that all of these electric fields increase inflammation. So whether there are some people say that in electrohypersensitivity syndrome, it's only affected by people that have an underlying health problem. This is true for all people, whether they link it with the electromagnetic pollution out there or not. Yeah, that's my current state take on it. You can do some things that I mentioned in terms of blood values, etc., to make an assessment of them, but I find it now much more practical because. When I started measuring, for example, those pro-inflammatory cytokines, the interleukin-6, etc., well, we're in a state now where there isn't any single patient that comes in that doesn't have high interleukin-6, yeah, which was different 20 years ago. So basically, they all have these markers, so very difficult to say, then to do a comparative study and say, well, look, here are the people that have it with it and without it. I can only say that the treatment that I would recommend to anybody is what you're doing, Keith, is to basically trying to get your environment, and even if you're in the big city, yeah, to basically look at, we know the intensity of the exposure is logarithmically. So it makes a huge difference whether the mobile phones is lying here or over there, but I'll get to that in a moment, yeah, because I have some simple suggestions of what I give people what to do with their mobile phones at their houses if they say they can't use it via cable or any other reason, because usually I ask people to do anything to do everything in their house with wired connections. Yeah, so I ask them to get a meter in order to know what are the magnetic fields, what are the low frequencies and the high frequencies fields that people are being exposed to. And then they can see, well, does it make sense to still work in these surroundings that I'm in, or do I have to move? Yeah, sometimes that's all I can say. Well, basically, if they have their 5G tower opposite to their living room, what am I supposed to say? Yeah, that's just it. And you're feeling symptoms, you have to go. But otherwise, try to minimize it by going to your sleeping room, measure it, take out the switch for your sleeping room, deactivate everything that has a high frequency, your Wi-Fi and all the other electrical gadgets in your house that nowadays are emitting it. So try to get to do that. And the next thing is use that tuning fork as many times as you can, because it will really get you back into the resonance with yourself, and then go out in nature. And I'm not talking only about doing a walk for half an hour. I basically tell them, go out, go with your car, go in the middle of the woods, go out with your meter, because even in the woods, sometimes you can be surprised what they put out there. And then take a little bit of water with you and some good, healthy, organic food. And then decouple yourself before you go into the woods with the tuning fork, so you get out of resonance, and then spend as much time as you can in the woods. Leave your mobile phone in the car or turn it completely off and put it away. So, desensitize your system from all the other influences and see how you are. At the same time, we know that lack of micronutrients, magnesium, calcium, B vitamins, etc., can increase the sensitivity to all of this. Yeah, we know that the calcium channels are affected. We know that magnesium is essential to maintain a healthy homeostasis. So get a good array of organic vegetable food and herbs, and try to stuff yourself with oxidative food that will calm down the oxidative stress in your system. We know from meta-analysis that 93% of all the studies that looked at oxidative stress, that is inflammation, with that it increases oxidative stress. That's why, for example, we developed a drink with over 70 different organic herbs, vegetable, and fruit. In order to take it, we did the studies. It can decrease oxidative stress. It can increase cell repair, etc. But of course, we couldn't send it to you to the US because customs would kill it. So right. I can only say, theoretically, if you're a patient here, that's what we would give to them. But otherwise, use make smoothies or juices that contain mostly vegetables, but put at least 10 different types of vegetables and fruit and herbs in it. There will always be a huge synergy. And basically, this would be the main thing I would do with people. The next stage would be to detox them, especially from heavy metals that work, of course, like an antenna in the body. So I would ask them to make a heavy metal analysis, a hair mineral analysis would do in most cases. And if that's the case, try to eliminate metals. And don't forget, people with tattoos, piercings, metal in their teeth, etc. It's all the time that through your skin, you do absorb those metals, and you should check them on a regular basis. I'm meaning once a year, where they have accumulated from all those fashion statements on your body or from all the metals in your mouth. And I'm also talking about braces, because any metal itself will create an electric field, because most of them are a combination of metals. It's not just one. So whether you have braces or whether you have an old mercury filling or whether you have a gold filling, it doesn't matter. You will have an enormous electrical stimulation. You will have a galvanic flow through it. You can measure that, and it's a multitude of what's usually present in your nervous system, which functions at about 90 millivolts. In order to get one message via a neuron from another. Yeah, that's the norm. And when you look at the trigeminal nerve here, and you have all these metals and the fillings, and the more metals, more different metals you have in your mouth, by the way, the higher, of course, the interaction will be, the higher the galvanic electricity will be. And you can see the stimulation, the hyperstimulation of the central nervous system, because the trigeminal nerve is a cranial nerve, goes directly into the brain and will have already a sensitization. When you then come up with a high frequency, you can sometimes see changes close to epileptic fits in an EEG when stimulating it with a background load of electricity or metals already being present in your body.
Do you have a detox that you can recommend to deal with aluminum in the body?
Okay. Well, talking about aluminum, we know that it's a severe neurotoxin, yet it will always lead to damage of the nervous system. Professor Chris Axley had his lab closed because he was criticizing alumini in our environment, because he was able to prove that it has a huge part in ADHD, in autism, in Alzheimer's disease, etc. And what he was able to show that silica is the main way to detox it. So there are even some mineral waters high in it, but otherwise there are some excellent silica products on the market. And I personally always combine it with a few other things like zeolite, and also like to mobilize it. But that's another topic that probably I should not talk about in the net, because anyway. Try to get when you do your testing, we do a hair mineral analysis, or we do a provocation test in the stools, because many of those metals, especially alumini, when they're bound, you don't really find them that easily. So if you mobilize them a little bit with coriander and silica for about 5 days, and then do a stool test and send them to a special lab, then you can be a little bit more accurate in the actual levels that you have in your system.
Much has been said about the importance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic balance within the body with regard to healing. Do you have any brief thoughts you'd like to share on this topic?
Well, that's of course a huge topic. The more we know about the fine balance in homeostasis we need between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, the more we understand many origins of diseases. I'm personally quite puzzled about all the research that's being established in the last few years on this balance, and how important is the flight and fight response is the one for the sympathetic nervous system to calm down our excitatory neurons, to calm down our nervous system, especially with the bombardment of information that we have and the quality of the information that we have. So I believe it's very, very essential to create a good hygiene when it comes to the digital world in our days. I personally advise everybody to go back to the good old days, with your checking your mails or your messages or whatever, to use it 3 times a day. So you decide when you go to the mobile device, instead of being basically dictated in your life what you should do by getting one alert after the next one. So try to get some places in between where you can be undisturbed, like in the good old days that we still remember, Keith, when we didn't even have an answering machine. Yes, so the phone was ringing, but if you weren't there, well, that was it. Yeah, they could call back in an hour. So this dependency of basically being reachable all the time, trying to decrease the sheer quantity, is already a huge step when it comes to basically harmonizing the sympathetic nervous system. But I do believe that in our days, we need techniques in order to calm that down. So we need some breathing techniques. We need some sort of meditation in order to calm us down, because we're constantly being bombarded with negativity and a lot of quantity. But we also have to find new ways to stimulate the vagus nerve, an example of the parasympathetic nervous system. And there are more and more devices that you can use to stimulate the vagus nerve. There are more and more techniques, from breathing, from gazing, combining it with breathing. I recently had the experience that a patient of mine was on an island in the Mediterranean Sea and had an acute attack of cardiac arrhythmia that she knew was linked to her autonomic nervous system. And she had been to hospital already, but they couldn't help her. And we did vagal exercises via the phone. and she could calm herself down, and the heart kicked into normal rhythm. So it's very powerful the more you understand about the influence of the vagus. And if we know about the hyperstimulation of the central nervous system, and also the increase of catecholamines, so from the adrenal glands, when you're exposed to a mobile phone or a Wi-Fi, your fight and flight response is being immediately triggered without a lion standing in front of you. Yeah, so you can measure that adrenaline and noradrenaline spike when just turning on a mobile device. So the first thing, of course, to reduce that input by all the means that you're recommending to people. And first of all, to use all your devices. I have my laptop here in the practice. I don't have a mobile phone. My children have mobile phones there. They don't know it in any other ways. They've always had it connected via cable at home, so it doesn't radiate anything. Try to get a minimalization of all the input of the high frequencies, low frequencies, and magnetic fields in your system in order to decrease, with the other measures that we mentioned, the influence of the sympathetic tonus, but then find ways to basically increase your vagal tone. I also use potassium in order to do that. That's a great way to stimulate the vagal nerve. That has a very, very calming effect. And I use other herbs as well in order to do that. There are wonderful herbs from the Ayurvedic medical field, ashwagandha and others, that help to calm down the adrenal gland. So there are lots of ways that you can insist on it, but the times are over where you can just claim to be in charge of your autonomic nervous system, because there's so many influences that you can influence and some of them you can't, that we need to find methods in order to counteract.
All right. Well, thank you. So do you have any last thoughts that you would like to share, and also let people know how they can get in touch with your work?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, my final conclusion is that how valuable these conversations are. So thank you very much, Keith, for being so open to invite all the interesting people that you interview on your platform, because it has become so difficult to get any good information about it. So that's the first thing. It's a moment of gratitude for what you're doing. That would be my first conclusion. The second is take the matter seriously. I think it's changing the fate of humanity. Looking at the cognitive function of our kids, as we mentioned beforehand, but looking at the cognitive function of all of us, I just developed a course, a 21-day course to reset the brain, which means detoxification and everything else, because it's such a huge aspect. And we were talking about the fact that almost any generation is now involved. The babies start to walk not with 12 months. They now start walking with 18 months, and that's considered to be normal. ADH and ADHD is considered normal in every classroom, that about a third of the kids are going crazy. The loss of concentration, the isolation that the digital world leads to, that's one aspect we haven't talked about, which I find very, very serious, that not only after the COVID area where people have been forced to stay at home already beforehand, people became lonelier and lonelier because the same areas of our brain are stimulating by having digital contact than by actual human-to-human communication. And you know, Keith, that there is a difference in direct human communication and in just digital exchange. Even if I very much value our time here, it can't replace the fact that if we would sit together in a seat and would be able to touch each other, we will laugh when we should laugh or whatever. It's not a replacement of the real thing. This isolation that it leads to is, for me, very worrying in the young. I see children having their best friend in the neighboring house. I just had one case this week And when asked how many times they see each other, it's once a week or once a month. They don't see the necessity to meet each other again, even if they just live next door, because they can communicate all the time via their mobile phones. And what this will create as an imprint into their brain for their social skills, I won't even talk about a relationship. I don't know how they will be able to do that. So there are so many areas and levels in which you could see we are harming our organs, not just the brain, not just parts of the nervous system, not just the heart, and not just the gut functions. We know that gut bacteria communicate in the frequencies of a mobile phone, so you can imagine how upset they are in our times. We talked about the pancreas. There have been studies out about the liver. It's only a matter of time until we know that it basically affects every cell of our body. Yeah. So we need to come to a point where we say, well, either we'll do a different way, or we'll have to pay the consequences. And with what I see in my patients every day, I'm not so optimistic for the majority of people, but I also see that more and more people are getting a little bit more reasonable, do see that it leads to isolation, do see that their sleep is getting worse, do see that their bodily functions are decreasing, and they're constantly exhausted because the mitochondria have been overstimulated the entire time. Exhaustion is something you mentioned at the beginning is normal nowadays, which it shouldn't be. We should be full of life force. And especially when looking at teenagers, they come back home from school and they lie down on the couch. I don't think that we would have ever done that. Yeah, coming from school and having to lie down to sleep. These are warning signs. And again, what you said, what is being considered normal shouldn't be normal. It's a very worrying thing that the majority is being affected that way. And so please take the matter seriously. And if you want to follow me, maybe Keith, you can write down my Substacks. I'm writing my own Substacks for Milli Vital Academy. I'm also writing Substacks for the World Council for Health. That's where most of my information will be coming from. And the rest will be just for the German-speaking audience. So,
Christof, I just wanted to say thank you for your continuing work in your practice and being so generous with your time with me today so we can talk about these important issues, and then as well as your work with the World Council for Health. So just very grateful for all of that. And, you have a very unique perspective being an osteopath, and what you shared about being able to feel the organs early in your career and teach many people around the world. And now we can't do that anymore. So obviously we're missing a great something. And I'll encourage people, if they haven't seen your guest post that you made recently, Pocket God, that was posted at the World Council for Health Substack. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for your time, Keith. And always there when you want another chat about that you think are issues worth talking about.